Hello and welcome to Litquake, San Francisco's literary festival. I'm Graham Todd, Litquake's deputy director. This year's festival runs from October 7th to the 23rd online and in person. You can find all of the details at litquake.org. Tonight we are honored to be able to present one of Litquake's favorite storytellers, Rabih Alameddine, in conversation with acclaimed novelist K.M. Soehnlein. We are celebrating the release of Rabih's new novel, The Wrong End of the Telescope, centered around an Arab American trans woman's journey among Syrian refugees on Lesbos Island. The New York Times called it spectacular. Alameddine's irreverent prose evokes the old master storytellers, their observations, toothy and full of wit, returning always to human absurdity. Before we get to that, a few quick orders of business. Tonight's event is live. You can actually interact with us. There's a Q&A button down at the bottom. We'll get to questions at the end of the show, but feel free to ask them at any time. There's also a chat function where you can show support to Rabih and KM and connect with your fellow book lovers. You can also support Rabih and KM tonight by buying their books at bookshop.org or to your friendly neighborhood independent bookseller. We also ask for your support of the Litquake Foundation to allow us to bring you these events largely for free. It's a precarious time for artists and arts nonprofits, and if you believe in keeping literature a key component of the Bay Area's cultural landscape, please consider dropping us a few dollars if you haven't done so already. We accept donations on Venmo at Litquake or directly at litquake.org/donate. Don't forget to follow Litquake on social media and our newsletter for the latest updates. And after tonight's show ends, a little window is going to pop up with a survey. Please fill this out. Surveys essential to Litquake's fundraising efforts. So let's get on with the show. Rabih Alameddine is a Guggenheim Fellow and the author of the novels An Unnecessary Woman, I the Divine, Kool-Aids, The Hakawati, and the story collection The Perv. Among the many awards he's won are the Lambda Literary, the Arab American Book Award, the Rome Prize, and the Dos Passos Prize. An Unnecessary Woman was also a finalist for the National Book Award. Interviewing Rabih tonight is K.M. Soehnlein, the author of the novels The World of Normal Boys, You Can Say You Knew Me When, and Robin and Ruby. He has been published in the nonfiction anthologies Girls Who Like Boys, and bookmark now Writing in Unreaderly Times, and in the Village Voice, San Francisco Magazine, and Out. He is the recipient of a Lambda Literary Award, the Henfield Prize, and the SF Film Rainin Filmmaking Grant. Without further ado, please welcome Rabih to read a little from his new novel, The Wrong End of the Telescope.
Hi, thank you, Graham. So I'll read a little segment, and then we'll get into the discussion. There's not much to know. The narrator is Mina. She's a trans woman surgeon who's visiting Greece to help with refugees. So this is self-explanatory. And the chapter is called The Little Rascals Go to Camp. Sumaya and her family rode the bus while Emma, Rodrigo, and I followed in the car. Luckily, we decided not to take my Opel that morning. Emma's rental Honda was much more comfortable. In the back seat, I suddenly felt exhausted and sluggish. Drowsiness overwhelmed me. Talking to me through the rearview mirror, Emma suggested that I close my eyes for a bit. It would be at least half an hour before we reached Morea. I fell asleep before she finished her sentence. I dreamt of my mother, of my father, of sitting before them as an adult, all of us underwater in the Mediterranean, something like that. Everything fleeting and hollow. I heard strange knocking noises, as if I were in an aquarium with some child knocking on the glass, my head echoing back. And indeed, it was a child who woke me, or rather 5 of them, 4 boys and a little girl, all in clothes that had seen better days if they'd ever had a good one. The kids stepped back from the car as soon as I turned, all of them giggling. I'd slept for hours, my head leaning against the rear window. I had a text from Emma explaining that she thought it would be best to let me sleep, that I should come to the camp when I woke up and call her. I stretched my arms, used the car's roof as support, which made the children laugh louder. I got out of the car asking them in Arabic if there was something wrong or if they found me generally amusing. The eldest boy, no more than 11, clad in a multi-darn sweater, explained that I was snoring loudly. He could hear my snoring through the car window, he said, but not his friend and lieutenant, pointing to a younger boy, because his ears were filthy. His ears had so much dirt, the eldest boy said, that you could grow wheat in them and make bread. The other boy, whose ears did not seem any dirtier than the rest, was not amused. It had rained sloppily while I slept, and all the cars parked along the road were still dripping. The children asked me where I was from, then introduced themselves. The leader, his lieutenant, and another boy were from the Aleppo area. The fourth boy was all the way from Pakistan and didn't speak Arabic, but he was fun nonetheless. And the blonde girl clad in strident colors was from Iraq and didn't say much because she was shy, but she had to be in the club because the leader's mother would beat him up if he didn't allow girls. And what did their club do? Well, it was formed only this morning, so their objectives were not entirely clear yet, but the main reason for the club's existence was mischief making. As in, his mother told him to take his friends and make trouble for other people, not her, if he knew what was best for him. And of course he knew, could they take me into the camp to meet my friend? Of course they could. And not only that, they would explain things to me, as I was obviously new, but it was going to cost me. No, not money, but a whole chocolate bar, or two, since there were 5 of them. And of course they knew I didn't have any chocolate on me. I didn't even have a purse, but I could buy candy at one of the cantinas over there, the boys said. The big one facing the gate had the best chocolate. The owners had given them 2 bars that morning for picking up all the paper cups and putting them in a garbage bag. And it was hours ago since they had chocolate, and they were 5, and it was only 2 bars, and they could tell me all kinds of things about Moria. The camp to my right, not the city in the Lord of the Rings, but they could explain the movie to me if I wanted, so I could buy them chocolate bars. Of course I should. Cars and vans were parked bumper to bumper on both sides of the narrow road. The Iraqi girl took my hand in hers. I thought she was following the universal edict of hand-holding when crossing the street, but then one of the boys grabbed my other hand. They were escorting me across, guides safaring me through the frightening savannah, making sure I wouldn't be attacked by a feral car. We passed a couple of wobbly snack trucks parked along the road. The boys called them cantinas. Apparently, there were gypsies the days before, selling new and used clothing out of the back of a truck, but nothing nice. We had to maneuver around numerous cantina patrons, primarily Syrians as far as I could tell, but at least 2 African men and one South Asian, almost all smoking and drinking coffee. Quite a number of them were charging their cell phones. The cantina sold everything anyone in the world could ever want, the boys explained. Did I need a phone, a SIM card, coffee, sugar, a sandwich, a foul-tasting banana ice cream, a much too expensive soccer ball, a messy t-shirt, anything my heart desired. And chocolate bars, I said. I bought them 5. I had to. The Greek owner, a woman in her 40s, suggested that I shouldn't have because they'd had too much sugar. She'd given them each a bar that morning, free of charge, after which they began to persuade her customers to buy them more. She'd lost count of how many bars they'd devoured. The little tricksters preened. I expected to find canary feathers stuck to the chocolate smears around their lips. When I asked the Iraqi girl how many chocolate bars she'd had, she put up 4 fingers. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabih. Thanks for reading to us from The Wrong End of the Telescope. If anyone hasn't seen the book cover, there it is. It's beautifully designed, beautifully written. So there's so many ways into this novel and into this conversation. Of course, there is the context of Lesbos 2 years ago as refugees fleeing Syria got on boats, paid their way to get on boats, and wound up on islands like Lesbos. There's the story of Mina, the trans narrator, who is a doctor who has her whole life story as part of it. how do you describe the book in your own words? When someone says, "What is this book?" Because there's so many pieces, there's so many moving parts.
Well, as you know, you develop sort of a spiel. I'm a fan of a quote by the poet Alan Grossman that basically said, "A poem is about something the way a cat is about the house." I'd like to tell people, my book is about something the way that a cat is about the house. It's difficult to describe because there's so many things going on. Primarily, I say it's about a book about Syrian refugees and what can be done about that, and the problems the volunteers and the refugees face with dealing with each other. And it's also the story of loss, and whether it's immigrants or refugees or just expats, what we lose when we move on, I don't think we really look at. So this book is an attempt to look at that part, like what is it that we leave behind? And what is the loss involved in that? Now, again, it makes it sound so depressing. So I always have to say, and it's a funny book.
There are children and chocolate. It's funny.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we get to the funnier part, I just want to ask, just for a little bit of context, because many of us don't keep up with the story, or we sort of tune in when there's a moment on the front page. But there's a line about, I don't know, a third of the book where the narrator says Lesbos was a somewhat humane mess when we were there. Shortly thereafter, it became an inhumane one. So can you just talk about the moment that the story is set in the larger story of that crisis, which got less and less humane?
Well, the story is set in January of 2016, a couple of months after sort of the big crisis of the boats coming and all the drownings that happened. And primarily, if you remember, the drowning of the boy, Alan Kurdi, who was photographed on the beach. And it was traumatic, and there was this big to-do, and Europe for a little bit had to open their borders. But in January 2016, there was the attack, right before there was the attack on Charlie Hebdo, and then there was the alleged, or the attacks in Cologne on the women, so that all of a sudden there was this big brouhaha and everybody started closing their borders. So when in 2016, when I was there, it was, like people were being processed. It was difficult, and there were lots of bureaucracy, but people were moving on. By the time I left, within a month or so, it got worse, as in Europe started paying Greece to return the refugees back to Turkey, and there were no place to go, and Turkey would return them, and then Moria became a almost like a concentration camp because they couldn't leave and stuff. So there were demonstrations and riots, and there were at least 2 big fires, if I recall correctly. So all of a sudden, the hope was closed, but the refugees didn't stop coming. They did not stop coming. So they kept coming and coming, and Greece would return them. Some would keep them. It just became too complicated.
Yeah, and it's not over, because
no, God, no. It's like, what was shocking to me when I first arrived was that it was not, I had assumed, because of the coverage, that all the people on the boats were Syrian, but it wasn't. I talked to refugees that came from Mali, that came from Congo, from Iran, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan. It's like, it's life is hard in so many places that they were trying for a better life.
I think one of the things that's so powerful is that you are a writer of characters. And so instead of the news story, the headline, the one iconic image that tugs at our heart, you give us a lot of people. Most of all, you give us Mina, wonderful doctor who starts out in Lebanon and winds up in America and comes out as trans and moves from the life she had as a child when she was assigned a male gender and lived as a boy to the life she's now leading in America. And Mina's the voice of the story. She's our eyes upon the story. So tell us all about how this wonderful character came to you and how she became the way for you to see this situation and voice the story for us.
Well, part of the thing is, yes, of course, I'm writing a talk that I have to give about what is a political novel, and I'm always fascinated that whenever people mention what a political novel is, it's always what I would consider as bad novels, which is novels that hit you over the head with, you must change this. But for the most part, I consider all novels to be political, really. But I'm not interested in the politics of it as much as the human situation of it. So basically, I do what all novelists do, which is look at people. But how did Mina come aboard? I had been working with refugees for a long time. I've been interviewing refugees in Lebanon for about four years, probably, before I went to Lesbos. And I went to Lesbos because two friends of mine went, and it was a disaster. And then I decided, I was going to Beirut, so I might as well go. And I did go, and I had a really rough time for many reasons I won't get into now. But what was interesting was that the main reason I had a rough time was because I could not separate. For the first time, I began to see the refugees as my people, because they're Syrian, we have the same background. They looked the same as my family, and I couldn't separate myself. So when I came back home, I tried to write essays about the refugees, and I wasn't able to. I wasn't able to write. Everything I wrote was shit. Until, John Freeman forced me to write an essay, and that did well. But for the most part, I wasn't able to write. And worse than the essays, I could not write a novel. I could not get into it. Everything I wrote, again, was shit, because I could not separate enough to see what needed to be done. So I had worked on this story with Mina as a character, but it was a completely different story. It was about Mina going back to Lebanon to confront her mother, and her brother is the in-between and moderator. And, it was not a bad story, but what was interesting was that it wasn't great. That's why, it's that all of a sudden I took this character into my novel and started to tell the story. And all of a sudden it fell into place. The voice was the right kind of distance. I needed to be able to see it. So that's why she came in. And the fun part for me is that the voice was right for many reasons. One was her being trans, but another is her being a surgeon. In my mind, surgeons and doctors in general, but surgeons in particular, are able to separate, like they can feel something or they can see something traumatic and are able to separate a little bit to actually do their work, which I could not as a writer do. I could not separate. But as Mina, I also sort of became somewhat of a surgeon. I could separate a little bit and write about it. So it worked. It worked.
I saw in your acknowledgements at the end of the book that you thanked several doctors. So I imagine that your research was making sure you got all of the medicines and the diagnoses and the body parts and everything.
Oh, yes. I now know more about liver cancer than I ever wanted to. And it's really like I said, doctors are weird, and I love them. But it was fascinating. They would give me details like, no, I don't want to know what the color of her stool would be. No, But that was really important to know.
To think like a doctor and care about the school.
Exactly. But it's like, that's the first thing that happens with liver. It's like, okay, I don't want to know about it.
Right. It's very convincing because we see Mina coming across this woman whose name is, I believe, pronounced Sumaya. Is that correct?
Yeah, Sumaya.
Sumaya, and she immediately does the kind of doctor scan of this woman, not as some layperson might think, like we're looking at sort of a figure washed upon the shore, but as a doctor looks at a potential patient, someone with a case.
Yeah, I mean, again, I talked to a number of doctors, and there was one doctor who is in San Francisco, and she specialized in refugee health. So it was lovely talking to her as to what she looks for when she sees the bag. It was really helpful. It was really helpful.
So I have a number of students who I teach at USF who are in the room tonight. We can't see any of you. It's just Rabih and I staring at each other, but we know you're all out there. And you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. I have asked my students to read your book ahead of time and submit some questions. And one of them I'm going to ask, this is from a student of mine named Peggy, who said, the story of Sumaya's illness and family is one of the dominant threads that drive the plot of The Wrong End of the Telescope. And she wanted to know why you chose this dying woman as one of the central characters in the book. So a question, I guess, in a sense about plot and character, right?
Mm-hmm. I could have gone in many different ways. There's a lot of stories in the book that I thought were worthy of, writing a novel about. But Sumaya was for me, she was the one that came forth. I mean, some writers tell you that characters write themselves, or, they take over. I don't believe in that. I mean, I do know that I create them and I make them behave in certain ways. But it was interesting that when I started writing about the approach of the refugee boat the first time, Sumaya showed up. And she came in my head fully formed. So that without knowing, by the end of that chapter, when they're going to the boat, I wasn't sure that, where the story was going, but all of a sudden she became so clear in my head that, I realized it's her. But then once that happened, like, why that family? Everything begins to fit into place. The whole idea of what refugees have to sacrifice to come, to move, what they lose and all that. And I could not think of a loss more than this woman willing to give her life for her family to move on. It was a big deal for me, when I started thinking about it, and it became a big deal in the novel as to, what do we give up? How much are we willing to give up? And, in this situation, it was a lot. So that's why she's the main, the main refugee story. But the other thing that's also just as important is I fucking love her. It's like, I mean, I always say I fall in love with my characters, but with Sumaya, I saw her from the first, like when she landed from, the shock on her face, when she figures out that Mina speaks Arabic, and, the whole sort of determination, and I'm in love with her. Again, it's really strange to say that, because, I create these characters and I fall in love, and it was love at first sight.
It's interesting because Mina sort of falls in love with her too. And as a reader, you're thinking, this woman is very difficult. And Mina just is sort of like, no, I get her.
She gets her. She gets her. Yeah. No, again, it was a lovely book for me to write on a number of things. Because with all the losses and stuff, what I wanted to show, and maybe it's because of the space that I was in, there's all kinds of love in the book. you know, from Mina's love of her brother to her brother's love of her, to how much she loves her wife, how supportive her wife is, how much she loves the unbearable writer, you know. It's like love, all the Sammy and Sumaya, I thought their relationship was so lovely, you know, and supportive and in the middle of hell, you know. So it was in many ways, as much as it was difficult to write in the beginning, all of a sudden it became really enjoyable.
I'm glad you got over that point where you couldn't write it to the point where you were enjoying writing it, because that's the magic point in the writing process.
You know? And you know, it's like let me admit that it's relative. You know, enjoying writing is relative. You know, it's like I wasn't beating myself and whipping myself every day anymore. So that was a good move.
Right. And for those people who in the audience tonight who are not writers and don't know what he's talking about, trust. A lot of beating and whipping going on at the desk. So you just mentioned the other really interesting character, but also sort of the interesting kind of literary device in this book, which is that there's this writer who's sort of floating through the book. He seems a bit like you.
Weirdly.
He has no name, but he's addressed as you by Mina. So Mina speaks to him. And so I've got another, student who read the book who said, she has a conversation with this man throughout the book, discussing things he has written that bear on her own challenges. He saw this as there was a kind of mysteriousness. This is my student Bryce asking this, and he says, "Can you talk about where the idea came from to have this unnamed writer character kind of on the periphery of the story?"
Okay, to be pedantic, where the idea came from is Borges. He doesn't use this exactly, but I've always loved, one of the things that he said was that if you want to write a book and you don't have the time, write a book about the book or write a story about the book, just describe the book. So one of the ways to avoid writing about the essays and all that is to just assume that they're written and talk about them. But also primarily, I wanted to talk about what happened to me and the difficulties that I had in a way, but my difficulties could not have happened to Mina. And that's why she's the narrator. She was able to be, and a character like me could not narrate this novel. So Mina would be able to deal with things that I, as a writer and as a volunteer, was unable to deal with. But at the same time, I wanted to present sort of the difficulty of being someone in Mina's shoes from different worlds, and the trouble that we had, or all of us have in trying to help, without that Mina could not do, because she's not as neurotic as the writer. She's not as, she is self-reflective. She's not that, but she's not self-reflective in a neurotic way, as in, like, oh my God, what am I doing here? Is this the right thing? Which is, I hate to say this, what most writers spend their time doing. A surgeon would not. So she couldn't go through that, but I wanted somebody to go through that so that these issues come to the surface. So all of a sudden, she has this relationship with this writer. And he's the one who has the nervous breakdown. He's the one who locks himself in a room and listens to Mahler. How self-indulgent is that? And I'm not going to say it happened because, it did happen, but I'm not going to say it.
I won't ask you if it happened because it did happen.
Exactly.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Borges. I'm no expert on Borges, the Argentinian writer, but the story becomes a kind of magic box puzzle, right? Because the writer in the book has asked the doctor to write the story, and then the doctor puts the writer in the story. So it's like, who's who, who's telling whose story and who's looking at whom, and it becomes, for me, not distracting, but kind of, it's a kind of delight of the book that in addition to this heavy, intense world history shifting context and story that's going on, we've also got this very kind of playful literary thing where our main character is talking to the writer who's actually creating our main character. And were you having fun with that kind of?
Kind of, yes, I definitely was. And there's also, the trick is always to make it somewhat mysterious, but not confusing. Because I wanted to write a clear book, it's a straightforward book, but the writer adds a certain mystery kind of thing, even though, by page 20, you figure out what's happening. It's not that. It's just that it adds a little playfulness, a little playful mystery to it that I enjoyed. But then at the same time, it added different layers that I did not expect. Like writing about the writer, not me, not the writer, dressing up in drag for the first time, added a different perspective to the book, in my opinion. Talking about the birds in the book in the father's house, that again, all these losses that come together in a different way, so that yes, it's mysterious, yes, it's playful, but I did it, and I kept doing it because I was seeing layers being built upon layers, and I liked that a lot.
One of the things I actually have really always admired about you as a writer, Rabih, is that your books speak and communicate very clearly about kind of the emotional lives of your characters. I always know where I am and who's guiding me through the story, but you always do something that surprises me. Like you have a novel that I love very much called I, the Divine, and the entire book is a first chapter of a woman trying to tell her life story, and she keeps starting over and starting over and starting over. And I know that was inspired by Calvino.
Yeah.
And so where have you always been this kind of writer?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it also has to do with what I like. I like playfulness. I mean, I think Calvino is a genius. I think Borges is beyond genius. I love Cortázar, and I all like these sort of postmodernist plays, but I'm always been different than they are in that I always liked characters and connecting to characters, and I love to be I wanted to say I love to be touched, and then it don't we all? But I love to be touched by books, and not just intellectually, which these books do, but on a human level. So I always thought, I always try and play with different things, but the fact that it's still clear to me in my head that I want to tell a story. I've said it many times, I am Lebanese. It is in our genes to be able to just want to tell a good story, so all the play is all the play, and I love it. And it adds to the novel, but it's the story I'm into.
Yeah. You have a lot of characters who appear either on the island briefly, like these children you just read about, or you have characters who are from the past of either Mina or the writer. Many characters who get a moment in the spotlight. One of my students asked about these characters we get just fleeting glimpses of. This is from Sweta, and she asked, how do you decide which characters to develop and which should just kind of keep in for a moment and off we go? And another student asked, how do you know what to leave out when you give yourself permission to put so much in? So can you talk about the full cast of many characters that you have in the book? How you make choices?
Sure. I have to say, a lot of it is not necessarily conscious. You know, a lot of what I write and work with is on instinct. But I've said this before, that if I have one talent, it's the ability to tell when something is off or something is right. So I will write a vignette and I will put it in a certain place. And then, you know, I come back to it and I may not, you know, it might be bad, it might be good or whatever, but what I do know is that it's working or it's not working in this place. And that's how I can tell. So a character, you know, will appear somewhere and he or she might not appear again. But if I read later and I'm thinking, oh, you know, what happened to this, then that person would have to reappear. If I don't, then the person doesn't have to. So the whole thing is not necessarily consciously studied, but it's just knowing what's off, knowing, you know, that, and I might not know that this character has to come back, but I will know that something is off. So I will try different things until it works. And, you know, I used to paint and it was always fun to me to think, oh, you know, this upper right corner here is not working. But if you work on the left lower corner here, that one will start working. So it's, like I said, you know, one character might not need to come back, but a theme or an idea has to come back. So if I put the character in again, it goes like, oh, that's not working, until I start putting something else in and see if that works.
What about GoFundMe, Jeff?
Oh my God.
The book really takes a lot of attention to look at volunteers or faux volunteers in the case of GoFundMe, Jeff, people who show up on the island. Talk a little about that.
The story of GoFundMe, Jeff, didn't exactly happen that way, because the trouble was I couldn't remember the story. But some volunteer, an American, was complaining that another American came to the island and left, that he raised money to come to the island and then just came to the island, and from there he went to other parts of Greece and just, you know, did whatever. And I kept thinking, this is such a nice scam, you know, and then I, you know, did some research and apparently quite a few did it, you know, and apparently, and somebody can have, because again, I can't prove any of them or something, but apparently there was someone who put a GoFundMe page, got all the money, never did anything. He just got all the money.
This must be happening everywhere with people raising money for things.
Well, it's definitely happening with you know, the last president, and you know, he's constantly asking for money to do all kinds of things that he never does, and people pay him. So I mean, somebody must have learned something.
GoFundMe Donald, right?
Yes, exactly.
GoFundMe
Don Jr.
Yeah, exactly. Don Jr. Don't fund him. Harleen asked about the inclusion of Greek mythological figures like Tiresias, Orpheus, Icarus woven into the story. Is that about the fact that you're in Lesbos, and so of course you're going to get Greek mythology?
Yeah, I mean, you know, all my books have a little bit, a smidgen, but you know, again, every character has to speak in her voice, and if she's in Greece, she has to, and you know, she has to look at Greek mythology, and she has to look at Sappho. You know, I mean, she mentions her a couple of times. The worst line, I wanted to take it out and then I keep it, and then they take it out, you know, was that there was a van as old as Sappho, and so I was like, ooh, I don't know whether that's good or bad. Finally, I think I kept it. So yes, it became, you know, allegorical to this. In the last book was a poet, so his language was very different, and his metaphors were primarily satanic in nature because Satan was a character, so the Quran and the Bible came heavily into this. In this one, it was probably more Greek myth, but also the Greek myths fit, I assume that there's a Greek myth for anything, but the whole sort of, Icarus falling down and drowning and, Tiresias becoming a woman for 7 years and then going back to being a man, and is just fit the story. Just fit the story. I mean, and again, my favorite was the fiddler, the violinist who died, and to find out that in the same spot is where Ion, I think is pronounced, the lyre player who won these awards and was thrown into the water, and the dolphins, because of Apollo, who fell in love with his songs, carried him to shore and stuff. I mean, that fits the story perfectly, I guess that's the beauty of Greek myths, really, because it's like you'll find something for anything.
Keep giving, yeah.
Yeah.
I just saw, I opened up the sidebar chat, which I had not been paying attention to, and Graham, our Litquake host, told me I might have some feedback because I'm fiddling and shifting over here in my seat. So I apologize if I've created any audio feedback for anyone out there in listening land. I also want to remind anyone that there is the Q&A function. If you push that button down there, we will get some more questions, and I'd be happy to take questions from anyone who's here. Looks like there are 44 of you out there, so. I do see
Kevin out there. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. And Matilda and Matthew.
Hi.
Folks. There is someone in the room, Percy Kareem, who said, I wonder if you are thinking about your book, the sacrifices of refugees this very moment when they are not headed to Lesbos, but to the US. And adds, I love that you are in love with her.
Do I think of refugees? Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's the way of the world now. I mean, it's getting bad so many places. Like the Haitian refugees, just recently, they broke my heart. And then to find out that even if it was considered, and that, Biden would consider sending them to Guantanamo, was just like, what the fuck? Yes, the Afghan refugees, I don't know what I can do right now. Like I said, at one point, Lesbos broke me. And then I had to wait for a couple of years, and then I went to Istanbul. I worked with refugees there, but I haven't for a while. And I don't know, if I go back, what form it will take. Before I left San Francisco, I was hoping to work with, prisoners in San Quentin. That's at least easier. I don't have much, but I can't do it right here. I don't know, again, part of the trouble is after a while, sort of what happened to me in Lesbos, I am unable to separate myself very well. So I have to figure out ways of helping, but not drowning with them.
Yeah. And the roles overlap, but the roles are not the same, right? The writer who creates stories and the citizen who attends to situations that need help, right? You're in a way, you're doing two different things. Yeah.
It's as a writer, if I go there wanting to write, that in and of itself creates a distance that for us writers we're able to manage, because we're basically interviewing, so I can hear stories and stuff, but to be able to help, I had to involve myself more, and that becomes difficult, because again, I don't know how to manage that. And it's really weird because I have lots of friends who have done it forever and ever and ever. And they say it's a skill one learns, I never had to rely on it because for the most part, I was a writer writing these stories. So I would come in, there's a distance, you tell me your story and I'm listening and I ask questions. Believe it or not, that is quite distancing. It separates us. It's like you're the teller, I'm the writer, I'm going to write your story. So it doesn't become people, it becomes their stories. But to be able to help, to be able to really listen, that has to drop. That wall has to drop. And when that wall drops, obviously, I become more vulnerable. And that's when, you're actually helping. But it's difficult. It's difficult.
I'm going to take a sharp turn right here, Rabih, because you called out Kevin, my husband, and he put a question in the chat. And
He did.
He did, and it's going to be a little bit lighter. It says, "I want to know more about quote foul-tasting banana ice cream," unquote, from the section you read.
Actually, I hate to say this, but that's a complete invention. I thought it's like they're talking about things that they like, but what would little kids hate? And I thought, ooh, a bad tasting banana ice cream. So that came in. I didn't have that one, no.
How to make up things like that.
Yes, then sorry, but it's really funny looking at it and remembering what was fiction and what was fact. Because after a while, and I'm assuming that, a lot of what you're writing becomes fact, that you actually think this happened, and it didn't happen, whereas some things happened. So, like somebody asked me, was Sumaya, based on a real character? Absolutely not, she was invented. So was Nina. But they feel real, so that all of a sudden I begin to actually think of them as real. Oh yes, I met Emma at that. It's like, she's a fictional character. It's like there was no one like, Rashid, the Palestinian nurse. There was no one like Mazen. These are all fictional characters. But in my head, I actually imagine meeting them. The kids now, I met them. They were making fun of me the whole time. And yes, I bought them chocolate. And yes, they sort of took advantage of me. And I loved it. Yeah. So again, it's the whole thing of what happened, which parts happened and which parts didn't. Like the scene at the port happened. The Afghan boys were there when I arrived. Whereas most of the other stuff didn't happen.
This is a question I'm going to ask, and I'm sort of forming it in my head, but it's something that comes up among my students in our fiction workshop. It's something that comes up when I just sort of read what's out there right now about fiction. But there's a certain, I think in our age of quote unquote reality, there's a sort of suspicion of fiction, right? Did this really happen? Did it happen the way you did? Did you get it right? Can you write that? All these kinds of things. Do you feel the sort of noise out in the social media and just out in the chatter?
Yes, I do feel it.
To write and all this kind of
stuff. I cannot not feel it. I mean, of course I feel it. And luckily I agree with a lot of it. It's like, yes, we should be careful what we appropriate, primarily because it's an issue of power. Who has the power and who gets to write about what. But when it comes to writing, the idea of thinking that something is restricted is just ridiculous. Or that you can appropriate something or not is ridiculous. Everybody appropriates, everybody, can write about whatever they want. Can they do it with enough respect? Is what we're talking about now. And more important, can you do it? And are we allowed to criticize when you do it badly? And this is the crux of the problem, is that a lot of the what they're calling cancel culture or whatever is primarily people in power being upset that they're being criticized. And they should be criticized. And I wrote about a trans woman. If my writing was not good or whatever, I expect to be criticized. I'll hate people, but you take it. But to actually tell me that I can't do something is just stupid. The trouble, like I said, is that unfortunately there's a power dynamic that we don't know how to talk about yet. That, I'm a gay man, I'm an Arab, so I'm not the top of the heap or whatever, but I am an established writer, so that I could write a novel about a trans woman, and it'll be read by some people, by 50 people, let's say. Whereas a trans woman who's writing can, write a better book and she won't be read. So there is a power imbalance. There is, this idea as to why is this book lauded and this book not, but it cannot go down to what I call stay in your lane thing. Because if I am to write about, what I know and stay in my lane, my books would be very, very boring, because I'm a really boring person. I'm a boring person with a vivid imagination. So yes. But like I said, it's a difficult subject because what is talked about for me is not usually what needs to be talked about. What needs to be talked about is, power dynamics, and how in the 21st century, we're still reinforcing certain power dynamics that are detrimental to all of us, except for a brief, small segment of the population. And then we, as opposed to negotiating and rebelling against that, start nitpicking on, oh, this is appropriation, or this is like, honey, we've appropriated for generations. I not just appropriate, I plagiarize. I steal from Borges, I steal from Calvino, I steal from everybody. It's what we do. So we can't, we have to listen to it. But the adamance, and again, it's like we're fighting on little things while the bigger problems we're not dealing with. I mean, this might be a change of subject, but one of the things that really fascinates me is that a lot of women who are anti-trans women keep saying that, they want to feel safe in a bathroom. They don't want somebody to dress as a man and, walk into to dress as a woman and walk into the bathroom. And I keep thinking, like, what kind of fantasy is that? But forget that they're anti-trans women coming into the bathroom because they don't feel safe, and the only safe place is the bathroom. And my question is, how can we in the 21st century still have women who feel threatened all the time, everywhere, except in a bathroom? It's like that women are threatened on the street and feel unsafe in their home, on the streets, everywhere. In the 21st century is the biggest problem I can think of. Yet we're arguing about, trans women going into the bathrooms. And I find that really fascinating. Really.
Well, yeah, it sounds to me in a lot of ways like the way you think about the world is you zoom quite far out and see the very largeness of the situation and of the issues, and then you zoom back in and you find character or characters to kind of embody those things. That's the way I sort of see some of the issues, for lack of a better word, in your book coming out. I guess I would say that I feel like in a sense on Lesbos, in this book, you've created a container. You've created a very flexible kind of container for social issues, for character types, for poetry, for mythology, for flights of fancy, for rage and anger and sorrow. I mean, this contained place becomes a place that holds quite a lot.
Well, I mean, again, we have to, like, if we start talking, I don't know whether we call it metaphysically, or that the book has to be contained. I mean, you know, the book is a contained thing. It has to have a beginning and an ending, and unless you're Proust, it has to finish in one volume. You know, so it has to be contained. So finding the frame to contain it. But again, the truth of the matter is that when I sat down to write, you know, this novel, even when I was floundering, it wasn't exactly the story of refugees that I wanted to write. I wanted to write about my experience. So I wanted to novelize that, and that didn't work. So that Mina comes in to tell the story and then becomes a novel about Mina. So that the refugees are there, and it's the story of them, but it's also the story of Mina interacting with the refugees, and with, you know, Emma interacting with the refugees. And so that, yes, it's a novel about refugees and the situation in Moria, but it's, like I said in the beginning, it's a novel about people, and that's what I'm interested in. That the issues are there, but nothing gets resolved. There's no epiphany. It's about people going through life. You know, it's about people like you and me, and some not like you or me, who are going through life, which is what every novel is. It's just that the setting happens to be refugees.
Well, you might be selling yourself a little short. I think you've done something very special with this book, and I don't think it's simple, and I don't think it's like every other novel, Rabih. To be just a little bit of a fanboy right here, I think this is a very special book.
No, okay, let's put it this way. It's like every other great novel. I'm just joking.
That's it. I want to acknowledge a few folks. We'll wrap this up in 5 to 10 minutes, but I want to acknowledge some people in the chat. Aina Selimovic, forgive me if I'm saying that wrong. As a fellow refugee, I was writing a question about the stickiness of appropriation, which I struggle with, but Rabih is now addressing this power dynamic. Thank you, helpful. Okay, so she was starting to write it, or he was starting to write a question before, and now we got there. Good. Thank you, Matthew, for your comment. Graham, our host, said, what do you think the fiction achieved that a journalistic approach couldn't? Because you've written both.
Many things, many things, and they're two completely different things. For me, fiction tends to move in a more subtle way. I can be a lot more direct in writing an essay that would not work in fiction. But at the same time, even my essays really are about stories, but fiction works differently. It's like there's, first of all, what me, and then the work itself. What fiction allows me to do is to relax, because, you know, I can lie, whereas with journalism, I can't, so that I don't have to prove something. And that for me is extremely helpful. But the thing that I like, and why I like fiction so much, is that a nonfiction book can do it. But for the most part, what fiction, when it's good and it's working, works in a mysterious way, which is it builds into something that is unconscious. It's not empathy. I hate that word. It's about posing. It poses questions that aren't even obvious that they're questions until much later. And I love that. Let's just say fiction is more insidious, in a good way.
That's why fiction writers get into trouble. folks, the Q&A button is there. The chat is there. You have a few minutes left while you have access to this wonderful man. And let me scan my students who've written very, very long and beautiful questions that I have not read in full. I adore you all, students. I'm sorry I haven't given you full justice here. You know, one of the things we're doing in my workshop is we're talking about inspiration. We're actually going back to that word that's often been sort of poo-pooed by a lot of people in the kind of academic writing class, where we're always told, have a habit, stick to your habit. If you write every day, the inspiration will come to you. And I've actually pulled back and said, where does inspiration come, and what do we, how do we harness it and capture it? And I wonder if that, where you stand on that subject of inspiration. Is there an easy answer? Is it not a word that resonates with you? But
oh no, inspiration is important. Usually, though, I mean, I don't write every day because, you know, it drains me. And, you know, I go through phases where I write for so long, and then, you know, I wake up and what happened to the world? But then I go for months without writing. I mean, it's been about 6 months now that I haven't been able to write anything, but, you know, I moved, et cetera, et cetera. But inspiration for me comes from books primarily. I'd be reading a wonderful novel and I think, oh my God, I can write a novel about that. But the other thing, and that's really what's important, is that I write when I'm angry about something. And that inspires me. It's not, you know, it's something that really, really annoys me, you know. And it has to be something that really annoys me and will keep annoying me for a long time, because it takes a long time to finish a novel. But that's usually what gets me inspired, you know. It's like I noticed now when I was talking about, you know, women feeling safe, that, you know, we live in a time when, you know, a lot of women don't feel safe walking the street. And that upsets me. So you know, as soon as I said that, you know, I started thinking, this really is shitty. Like, how would it like to be a woman where you don't feel safe? You just don't feel safe. Then, of course, I remember, well, hello, I'm a gay man, and I spent most of my life not feeling safe. And, you know, and so these things begin to build. All of a sudden, you know, it begins, and I understand that, okay, so what does it mean to be safe? And what would a character would, and that's how it starts. Now, I'll get over that, I think, you know, because I want to write something else. But usually those are the things that inspire me.
Anger and annoyance.
And yeah, oh God, yes. And get my favorite way of getting inspired to write, get dumped, you know, by a boyfriend, and then, you know, write a book with him not in it.
I mean, that's probably a pretty good note to end things on. Is there any last question? I see Graham at Litquake Foundation writing to everyone, buy the book, this book, any book, at litquake.org/shop/litquake. I just want to say thanks to everyone who stayed with us and listened and threw some questions in. And I want to thank Rabih for your time.
And thank you, Carl. And thank you, Graham.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This is a wonderful conversation. I want to remind everybody again to buy the book, buy any book, buy Can's book, Rabih's book. The festival runs for another 10 days until the 23rd. We have an in-person lit crawl once again in San Francisco. You can find all the details at litquake.org, and that's it. Thank you guys again. Thanks everybody for watching.
I'm going to be part of one of the Lit Crawl events with a group of writers that are being published by a new LGBTQ press called Amble Press. It's
right.
At 5 p.m. on the 23rd, Saturday the 23rd. It's live, not on Zoom. So if you're in the San Francisco area, you can come, and I'll be emceeing, and there'll be four queer writers reading that.
Nice. At the makeout room, right?
At the makeout room. Come make it.
Yay.
Excellent. All right. See everybody there.
Thank you. And anyone who's a student of mine, I'll see you in 10 minutes on the other link to have a follow-up class. And Rabih, thanks again. Thanks,
Thank you guys. Good night.
Bye.